Welcome to a brand new adventure, friends. In this episode, we'll be listening to the story of Gabriel and the alien queen Valentina. The story is very enjoyable, so please stay with me until the end. Our story begins now. Enjoy watching. Everyone rejected the ugly alien woman, but one human man pointed her out because she was actually a queen. The twin sons of Gabriel hung in the sky like a pair of quarreling gods who couldn't agree on who got to burn you worse, and Gabriel had long since stopped taking it personally. He shouldered through the slave market square with the particular slouch of a man whose purse was lighter than his conscience, and whose conscience, if he was honest, wasn't carrying much weight to begin with. Dust coated everything: his boots, his teeth, the fluttering merchant banners that snapped overhead in colors that had once been proud and were now the shade of things left too long in the sun. He was here for cheap cargo, something he could buy low, sell high, and forget about entirely. That was the whole of his ambition, and it fit comfortably in a coat 2 sizes too optimistic. The auction block reeked of sweat and desperation, and the cloying perfume the auctioneers wore to disguise the first two. Gabriel drifted past pens of grumbling laborers and one very indignant merchant's clerk, who'd apparently gambled himself into servitude and was still arguing about the dice. He was about to write off the whole miserable afternoon when he saw her. She stood at the block's edge, where the auctioneer shoved the lots he'd already given up on, hooded, cloaked, still. A knot of buyers circled her the way scavengers circle something that hasn't quite finished dying, and their verdict was loud and unanimous. "Green as a bruise," snorted a fat man with rings on every finger and taste on none of them. "Skin like spoiled fruit," laughed another. A woman flicked back the alien's hood with 2 fingers, the way you'd lift a lid to check if the milk had turned, and there it was: pale green skin, a face plain by the market's cruel arithmetic, and 2 ears that swept up into delicate elven points. The crowd made a noise of collective disappointment, as though she'd personally promised them something and failed to deliver. "Worthless," the fat man declared, and drifted off to bid on someone with better resale value. Gabriel should have drifted with him. Every instinct sharpened by years of thin margins told him to keep walking, that pity was a luxury he couldn't afford and mystery an even more expensive one. But something snagged him, the way a nail catches a sleeve, and held him in place. It was her posture. Broken things slump. Gabriel had bought enough sorrow in his time to know the geometry of despair, the bowed spine and the downcast eye and the shoulders folded inward like a letter no one would ever send. This woman stood as though the auction block were a dais and the jeering crowd her subjects. Her chin was level. Her spine was a plumb line. And when the woman who'd flicked back her hood turned away laughing, the alien's gaze followed her. Not with fear, not with the wet-eyed hope of the desperate, but with the cool, unhurried assessment of someone deciding exactly how much that laughter would cost, and when the bill would come due. Gabriel had seen a lot of eyes in a lot of markets. He had never seen eyes appraise a room like they already owned it. He found himself stepping closer, which was, he'd reflect later, the precise moment his quiet afternoon died a sudden and violent death. The auctioneer brightened at the approach of anything resembling a customer. "Ah, the gentleman has an eye for a bargain, sturdy enough, bit sullen. I'll practically give her away on account of the He gestured vaguely at all of her. "The color." Gabriel didn't answer. He was looking at her wrist, where the cloak had fallen back an inch, and at the markings there, faded, deliberate, coiling lines of a script he'd seen exactly once before. On a ruined coin an old smuggler had shown him and called cursed. Royal script. Aster Dominion royal script, the kind that hadn't been legal to wear since the empire fell and its queen vanished into rumor. His mouth, which had a long and troubled history of moving before his brain approved the motion, opened. "You've got her tagged wrong," Gabriel heard himself say to the auctioneer, in a voice that carried farther than he'd intended across the suddenly curious square. "This isn't a laborer." He met her eyes then and found her watching him with an expression that was almost terribly, like amusement, as if she'd been waiting a very long time for someone in this dust pit to finally get the joke. This is Valentina, lost queen of the Aster Dominion. For one breathless heartbeat, the entire market froze. The haggling, the laughter, the clink of coin, all of it stopping at once, as if the twin suns themselves had leaned in to listen. And somewhere in the silent crowd, a hand slid quietly toward a concealed blade. The silence held for exactly as long as it takes a coward to gather his nerve, which is to say not very long at all. Gabriel had spent enough time in frontier markets to develop a sixth sense for the specific texture of a crowd about to do something regrettable, and the square had gone from disappointed to dangerous between one breath and the next. The auctioneer, sensing his profit margin evaporating along with his life expectancy, took a careful step backward off his own block. Somewhere to Gabriel's left, a merchant's banner snapped in the hot wind like a slow round of applause for the worst decision he'd ever made. Then the hand he'd half-glimpsed finished its journey, and a blade came out into the sunlight. The man holding it was unremarkable in the way that expensive killers cultivate: plain robes, plain face, the studied ordinariness of someone who'd paid good money to be forgotten. He wasn't looking at Gabriel. He was looking at Valentina with the flat, businesslike focus of a man completing a very old assignment. "Huh," Gabriel said, mostly to himself. "So you're real." "I am generally considered so," Valentina replied. Her voice was low, dry, and carried the faint accent of somewhere that no longer appeared on any map. It was also the first thing she'd said, and Gabriel was distantly annoyed to notice it was more composed than anything that had come out of his own mouth in a decade. "You have a talent for announcements. Have you a similar talent for what follows them?" "Define talent." "Do you have a weapon?" "I have a personality." The assassin moved. So did Valentina, and this was the moment Gabriel's entire understanding of the afternoon rearranged itself with a lurch. He'd expected to shove her behind him. Instead, a hand shot out, her hand, still chained at the wrist, the length of loose chain swinging up in a bright silver arc, and the assassin's blade met 3 links of Aster Dominion iron with a sound like a struck bell. The knife spun away into the dust. Valentina stepped into the space it had occupied, drove an elbow into the man's throat with the crisp economy of someone who'd been very well taught a very long time ago, and let him fold to the ground while she was already turning to look at Gabriel with an expression of profound, patient disappointment. "You froze," she observed. "I was admiring the technique." "Run now, admire later." That, at least, was advice Gabriel could act on without moral reservation. Because the assassin hadn't come alone. Of course he hadn't. Killers of that quality never did. And now 3 more plain-robed figures were shedding their disguises at the edges of the square. And worse, the slavers were waking up to the fact that the worthless green woman they'd nearly given away was in fact the single most valuable person to set foot on Caravel in a generation. Greed and murder converged on the same point from opposite directions, and that point was, inconveniently, exactly where Gabriel was standing. He grabbed her chained wrist and ran. They went through the market not so much fleeing as demolishing. Gabriel had a gift for turning any environment into an obstacle course for the people behind him, and he deployed it now with reckless generosity, overturning a spice cart into the path of the first pursuer, ducking a laden clothesline that caught the second across the face in a burst of someone's laundry. "Left," he shouted. "No, my left, your left is also, just follow the man who owns the ship." "You own it?" Valentina asked, vaulting a crate with maddening grace. It looked abandoned. "That's the aesthetic." A blaster bolt scorched the wall beside his ear, close enough to smell, and any further defense of his ship's honor died in his throat. They spilled out of the market's far arch into the docking yard, where his vessel crouched among sleeker craft like a tired dog among show hounds. She was called the Margin. She was held together by optimism and welding, and at that particular moment Gabriel had never loved anything more. He slammed his palm against the hatch panel. It considered his request with the leisurely reluctance of aging machinery. "Come on, come on." "They are gaining," Valentina noted, with the calm of a woman reporting the weather. "You could sound slightly more alarmed." "I have been hunted for 6 years across 9 systems, trader. I have exhausted my supply of alarm. I am running purely on spite now." The hatch groaned open. Gabriel shoved her through it, threw himself in after, and hit the seal as the first pursuers reached the yard. Through the closing gap he caught a last glimpse of the square, the banners, the dust, the fat man with the rings gaping at the fortune that had just sprinted out of his grasp, and then the door thunked shut and the noise cut to silence. For a moment they simply stood in the cramped airlock, breathing hard, the deposed queen of a fallen star empire and the broke man in the hopeful coat, dust settling around them like the punchline to a joke neither had finished telling. So Gabriel managed, drink. The drink, it turned out, would have to wait, because Caravel had opinions about ships leaving without paying their docking fees, and those opinions were currently expressing themselves as 2 patrol skiffs peeling off from the port tower to give chase. Gabriel threw himself into the pilot's seat and coaxed the margin off the ground with the tender, pleading tone of a man negotiating with a creditor. The engines caught, coughed, considered the matter, and then decided to cooperate out of what he could only assume was pity. The docking yard fell away beneath them, the twin suns wheeled across the viewport, and the whole rattling frame of the ship shuddered as they clawed for the sky. "They're following," Valentina said. She had folded herself into the co-pilot's seat as though it were a throne she was merely tolerating, and she watched the pursuit on the cracked rear display with an expression of mild professional interest. "They always follow. It's the leaving them behind part I specialize in." Gabriel banked hard, threading the margin between 2 rock spires that jutted from the desert like the fingers of something buried and annoyed about it. The skiffs, faster and newer and crewed by people with functioning depth perception, took the gap without slowing. "Okay, they're good." "You sound surprised." "I'm disappointed. I had a whole speech prepared about the incompetence of frontier law enforcement." He hauled the ship up into a climb that made every unsecured object in the hold rediscover gravity in a new and personal way. Hold on to something regal. The sky darkened from bronze to bruised violet to the deep, honest black of space, and the moment they crossed into it, Gabriel did the one thing the margin did better than any ship her size. She ran. Not fast. The margin had never been fast, but elusive in the way of a stray cat that has never once in its life been where you expected it. He killed the running lights, cut the main drive, and let the ship drift silent and dark into the shadow of Caravel's larger moon, coasting on nothing but momentum and nerve while the patrol skiffs shot past overhead, sweeping empty vacuum with their scanners and finding, to their evident confusion, absolutely nothing. Gabriel exhaled, slow and quiet, and only started breathing again when the skiffs shrank to pinpricks and vanished. "And that," he said, "is why you buy the ugly ship. Nobody bothers to look for the ugly ship." Valentina was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, "That is not a foolish philosophy. I have several. They're all about the merits of being underestimated. It's a rich vein. I imagine it would be for you." But there was no bite in it. If anything, there was the faint ghost of something that might, in better light and a more forgiving woman, have been the beginning of respect. She turned in the seat to face him fully, and for the first time since the market, Gabriel got a proper, unhurried look at her without a mob trying to kill or buy them. The green skin, the pointed ears, the plain features the crowd had jeered at, which up close weren't plain at all so much as unadorned, stripped of everything decorative until only the essential structure remained, cheekbone and jaw and a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled in years and remembered how it worked anyway. The royal markings coiled up her forearm, black against pale green, and the eyes still doing that thing where they seemed to be quietly cataloging everything, including him, especially him. "You are wondering," she said, "why you did it." "I'm wondering a lot of things. That's near the top," Right under "Why does my mouth hate me?" You had nothing to gain. A worthless slave, the auctioneer said. You could have walked past. Everyone walked past. She said it without self-pity, the way you'd state the boiling point of water. For 6 years, trader, everyone has walked past. It is, I have found, a remarkably efficient disguise. No one looks for a queen in the discard pile. Gabriel busied himself with the drift controls, which did not need adjusting, because the alternative was meeting her eyes while he answered, and he wasn't sure he had an answer worth the price of admission. You stood wrong, he said finally. I what? Everyone else on that block, they stood like the market told them what they were worth, and they'd agreed to the terms. You stood like you were doing the crowd a favor by letting them look at you. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the honesty and covering it badly. I've spent my whole life selling things for less than their worth and buying them for more. I know overpriced junk when I see it, and I know when the tag's wrong. Yours was wrong. She looked at him for a long, weighing moment. The same appraising stillness she'd turned on the whole cruel market, except that this time, at the end of it, something in her guarded face eased by a fraction of a degree. You are a strange man, Gabriel. You remembered my name. You announced it to an entire square while people were trying to stab me. It was difficult to forget. She settled back, and this time the ghost of the smile very nearly arrived. Now you mentioned a drink. The drink was terrible, which Gabriel felt honor-bound to warn her about before he poured it. This is not, technically, a beverage, he said, retrieving a dented bottle from a compartment behind the galley's least trustworthy panel. It's more of a survival strategy. A man on the relic run traded it to me for a broken compass. I've since concluded he got the better deal, the compass, and possibly my liver's respect. He splashed an amber inch into 2 mismatched cups. One bore the faded logo of a shipping company that no longer existed. The other had a crack he'd learned to drink around, and slid one across the little fold-down table that constituted the Margin's entire dining establishment. Valentina considered the cup the way she considered everything, as a potential threat requiring assessment. Then she drank, and to Gabriel's considerable admiration, did not so much as flinch. It tastes, she said thoughtfully, like a punishment. It is a punishment. That's the flavor profile. They put it right on the label in a language I've chosen not to learn. She almost laughed then. He saw it happen, saw it start somewhere behind her eyes and travel most of the way to her mouth before the years caught it and pulled it back down. It was, he thought, the saddest thing he'd witnessed all day, and he'd spent the afternoon in a slave market. Whatever had been done to her, it had gone deep enough to teach her that laughter cost something she couldn't spare. So he did what he always did with silences that got too heavy. He filled them. He told her about the compass, and the man on the relic run, and the time he'd smuggled a cargo of sacred temple statues that turned out to be full of contraband cheese, and the resulting theological and gastronomical crisis that had gotten him banned from an entire moon. He was not, he'd be the first to admit, telling these stories to inform her. He was telling them because every time he got to the ridiculous part, that caught laughter climbed a little higher up her throat, and he decided somewhere over the cheese that he wanted to see how far it could get. It got all the way out on the story about the customs official and the very confused goat. It wasn't a large laugh, more of a startled exhalation, quickly stifled, as if her own body had betrayed her. But it was real, and something in the cramped, humming little galley shifted warmer by a degree. There it is, Gabriel said quietly. Thought you'd lost that in the discard pile too. The warmth vanished. Not sharply, she didn't recoil, but a shudder came down behind her eyes and she turned the cracked cup slowly on the table. I did, she said, for a while. When you have watched everyone you were responsible for die, laughter feels like a theft, like joy you have no right to, purchased with lives you failed to keep. Gabriel said nothing. He'd learned, eventually, that the hardest thing in the galaxy was to sit in someone's grief without immediately trying to fix it, and it was a skill he'd acquired late and at great cost. My court did not fall in battle, she went on, in the flat, careful voice of someone walking a familiar and dangerous road. That would have been cleaner. It fell to a man named Cassius who had sat at my father's table, who had held me as a child, who smiled at me across the throne room while his people opened the gates. The Astor Dominion did not die of an enemy traitor. It died of trust, my trust. She looked at the black window and the stars beyond it. There is a remnant, a handful who escaped, hiding in a dead fortress on the edge of the old territory, waiting for a queen they believe is coming. 6 years I have been trying to reach them. 6 years of markets and chains and men with plain faces and hidden knives. And every year I am a little less certain the woman who arrives will be worth the wait. It seems to me, Gabriel said carefully, you just chain-whip-parried a professional assassin about 40 minutes ago. Personally, I'd wait for that woman. That woman is a survivor. It is a different thing from a queen. She finally met his eyes again, and the fire he'd glimpsed in the market was there, banked but unmistakable. A survivor runs. A queen turns around. I have forgotten how to turn around, Gabriel. I am not sure I remember what I would be turning around for. And that, Gabriel thought, was the crux of it. Not the empire, not the throne, not even the usurper. Just a woman who'd been running so long she'd forgotten there was any other direction, and had started to suspect there was no longer anything inside her worth stopping to defend. He should have said something wise. He had a strong suspicion the moment called for something wise. What came out instead was, for what it's worth, you'd be turning around for a dead fortress full of loyal people who never gave up on you. That's not nothing. Most folks can't get a single person to wait 10 minutes. He refilled her cup. I once got left at a rendezvous by my own crew. They took the ship. I got it back, obviously. He gestured at the margin around them. But it does recalibrate your sense of what loyalty's worth. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she lifted the terrible drink in something that was almost a toast. To the ugly ship, she said, and the people who don't bother to look for it. To turning around, Gabriel answered, eventually, when you're ready. They drank, and somewhere out in the dark, still 6 years and one dead fortress away, something began quietly to change course. The dead fortress was, Gabriel felt, poorly named, on the grounds that it was actively trying to kill them. The margin limped out of the jump at the ragged edge of the old Astor territory, into a graveyard of a system where a burned-out star gave just enough light to see by and nothing at all to live by. And there it hung against the dark. Valentina had called it, the last redoubt, a station the size of a small moon, scarred and silent, half its ring structure sheared away in some ancient battle and left to drift. It should have looked defeated. Somehow it managed to look patient instead, like an old soldier who'd sat down to wait and simply never been given the order to stop. Home, sweet home, Gabriel muttered, easing them toward the one docking spar that still showed a flicker of power. You're certain they're friendly, because in my experience, hidden remnant of a fallen empire, and friendly are not words that historically enjoy each other's company. They are loyal, Valentina said, but he noticed her hands had tightened on the armrests, and that the closer they drew to the station the straighter she sat, the more the survivor receded and something older and colder and more sovereign came forward to take her place. She was putting the queen back on like armor she'd left in storage, and it fit worse than it used to, and she knew it. They were met at the airlock by 6 armed figures and a great deal of leveled weaponry, which relaxed by degrees as an old man at the front of the group got his first proper look at her. He was gray now, and stooped, and he wore a uniform kept immaculate in defiance of every practical consideration, and when he recognized her his whole face broke open like something that had been holding itself shut for 6 years. "My queen," he breathed, and went down on one knee on the cold deck, and the others followed, and Valentina stood among the kneeling remnant of everything she'd lost and looked, for one naked instant, absolutely terrified. Her name, Gabriel gathered over the next hour, was better remembered here than anywhere in the galaxy. The old man was Henry, her father's master-at-arms, who had carried the infant princess out of the burning palace 6 years past, and had been holding this rusting station together with discipline and stubbornness ever since. There were 40 of them left, 40 out of an empire. They fed Gabriel and Valentina in a hall built for thousands, and the emptiness of it pressed down on the little gathering like a hand. And it was there, over the first real meal Gabriel had eaten in a week, that everything went wrong. He noticed it the way he noticed a bad trade, a wrongness he felt before he could name it. A young officer near the back of the hall who watched the doors more than the queen, who didn't eat, whose eyes flicked once to a chrono on his wrist with the specific anxiety of a man counting down. Gabriel had spent his whole life reading the small tales of people about to do something they'd been paid for, and he'd nearly gotten killed enough times by missing them that he'd learned, finally, not to. "Valentina," he said quietly, setting down his cup. "The one by the door, green sash, he keeps checking the time." She followed his gaze without turning her head, a skill, he suspected, that royalty learned early, and he watched recognition and heartbreak arrive in the same instant. "Owen," she said softly, "he was a page in my mother's household, a child. I taught him a card game." And then louder in a voice that cut the murmur of the hall to silence, "Owen, how long?" The young officer went very still. And then, because there was nothing left to gain from pretending, he stood, and his face crumpled into something that was half defiance and half plain misery. "20 minutes, Majesty," he said. "Maybe less. Cassius pays. He pays well, and 40 people cannot eat loyalty, and his voice cracked, "I have a sister on the lower ring who has not eaten properly in a year. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. He's coming. His fleet is already inbound. I'm sorry." Henry was on his feet with his weapon drawn, roaring for the doors to be sealed, and the hall erupted into the controlled chaos of soldiers who drilled for a disaster they'd prayed would never come. And in the middle of it, Valentina did not move. She stood at the head of that long, empty table and looked at the trembling young traitor who'd sold them all for his sister's supper, and Gabriel watched her hand drift toward the sidearm Henry had given her, and he watched the fire in her come fully, finally, terribly awake. Here it was, the turning around. 6 years of running compressed into a single cold decision, with the man who'd betrayed her standing weaponless and weeping 20 feet away, and every year of grief and rage entitled to its due. "Valentina," Gabriel said, just her name. He didn't tell her what to do. He'd learned that much. You don't tell a queen what to do. He just said her name and let it hang there, a reminder that she'd asked him once what she'd become if she ever stopped running, and that this, right now, was the answer taking shape. Her hand stopped on the grip of the gun. The station shuddered as the first of Cassius's ships dropped out of jump beyond the viewports, dozens of them, a wolf pack closing on a wounded thing, and every soul in the hall turned to their fallen queen to see, at last, which kind of woman had come home to them. Valentina took her hand off the gun. She crossed the hall to Owen instead, past Henry's raised weapon, past 40 held breaths, and she did not strike him. She took the traitor's face in both her hands the way, Gabriel imagined, you'd hold a child you'd taught a card game a lifetime ago, and she said something too low for the room to hear. Whatever it was, it broke him more completely than any blow. He sagged, sobbing, and she caught him. And to the entire watching remnant of the Astor Dominion she said, in a voice that had finally stopped running, "No one here starves again. Not while I breathe. That is the empire I am rebuilding. Now get his sister off the lower ring and help me not die in the next 20 minutes." And just like that, the queen was home. What followed was, in Gabriel's professional opinion, the single most magnificent piece of improvisation he had ever been privileged to witness. And he'd once talked his way out of an execution by pretending to be the executioner. Because Valentina, it turned out, had not spent 6 years merely surviving. She had spent them learning every slaver's trick, every smuggler's dodge, every ugly practical thing a queen raised in palaces would never otherwise know. And now she poured all of it into the defense of a station that had no business surviving the hour. Cassius thinks he's hunting the wounded, she said, bent over Henry's flickering tactical display while the old man stared at her like she'd risen from the dead a second time. He's built his whole approach around a broken station and a broken woman, so we give him one. She jabbed at the display. Vent atmosphere from the sheared ring. Make it look like a hull breach. Make it look like we're dying. We are dying, Henry pointed out. Yes, but convincingly. She turned to Gabriel, and there it was at last. The smile arrived whole and fierce and 6 years overdue, and it was aimed straight at him. Traitor. You told me nobody bothers to look for the ugly ship. How do you feel about proving it at scale? The plan was insane. The plan was also, Gabriel recognized with a lurch of pure delight, exactly the kind of thing he'd have done, which was possibly the most alarming realization of the entire ordeal. They played dead. They vented the ruined ring in a convincing gout of atmosphere and debris, killed every light and signal, and let Voltham drift silent and dark and apparently lifeless while Cassius's fleet swept in close. Too close, greedy close. The way the fat man in the market had leaned in over what he thought was worthless, to savor the kill. And when the usurper's flagship slid past the sheared ring at point-blank range, close enough that Gabriel could read the name painted on her hull, Valentina sprang the trap. The margin came screaming out of the debris field where Gabriel had hidden her, transponder blaring a distress code he'd stolen off a customs cutter years ago and never found a use for until precisely now. A code that told every automated defense grid in the old Astor territory that this vessel was Dominion sovereign and under attack. The fortress's ancient guns, dead for 6 years, woke to their rightful queen's command and to a legally screaming distress beacon, and they did not hesitate about which ships to fire on. Cassius had brought his fleet into the one place in the galaxy where the walls still remembered whose they were. It was over in 90 seconds. It was not clean, and it was not painless, and good people on that dead station died buying those 90 seconds. But when the smoke cleared and the last of the usurper's ships was either scrap or fleeing, Voltham still hung against the dark, scarred and patient and held, and 40 souls who'd waited 6 years for their queen looked out at the wreckage of the man who'd stolen everything and understood, finally, that the waiting was done. They found Cassius's flagship crippled but intact. Valentina did not gloat. She simply took the surrender and the throne it represented, with the same cool stillness she'd once turned on a cruel market, except now, at the end of it, there was warmth underneath. The rebuilding took years. Gabriel knew this because, to his own continued astonishment, he was there for it. The lost queen of the Astor Dominion reclaimed her star empire not as the cold legend history remembered, but as something new. A monarch who'd been to the discard pile and back, who fed her people first and forgave where forgiveness cost her, whose court would learn that their queen kept a terrible bottle of relic liquor in her private chambers, and that the surest way to see her genuinely laugh was to mention a goat. On the day they crowned her again, in a restored hall that finally held more than 40, Valentina descended from the dais in front of the assembled remnants of a galaxy she was stitching back together, and she did not extend her hand to a courtier, or a general, or some visiting king brought to court her power. She crossed the whole long floor to a slouching man in a coat 2 sizes too hopeful, who'd once nearly walked past her because he was late and broke and looking for cheaper cargo. You could still leave, she told him quietly, the way she'd offered him every out for years, because she was a woman who'd learned the hard way never to assume anyone would stay. The ugly ship's still in the bay. Nobody's looking for it. Gabriel looked at the queen the whole galaxy had overlooked and took her hand. Nah, he said. I already found the one thing worth more than the tag said. Be terrible business sense to walk away now. And for the first time in his whole restless, running life, Gabriel decided to stay. Another story comes to an end, friends. Please don't forget to hit the like button, leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Traveler for more stories. Take care until the next story.